Best ball season is well and truly here. It's starting earlier and earlier every year, Shawn, as we've continued to discuss on the podcast. I was at a convention this week over in the UK, and lots of talk about best ball drafting over there. And I was at the expo in Canton last year. A question was raised at a best ball panel: how many or who here has played best ball? And maybe 25% of the room put up their hand. At the one this week, when I did the best ball panel, there was maybe 4 people in the entire room hadn't done it. So we can see that's mainly DraftKings expanding into the UK over on that side of things. But at this time of year, to have that many people in the UK wanting to draft best ball drafts is certainly impressive. And it shows, I think, the growth of the game, both globally and, of course, in the US. But Underdog really heating things up with their contest offerings throughout the year. We obviously have the FFPC with their fantastic offerings as well. We play across pretty much all of the options available to get in on some of that action. But looking at ways to win is obviously a key part of trying to win those contests. And Shawn is well known for some of his contrarian thoughts throughout the year. Shawn, maybe some of those contrarian thoughts now becoming a little bit more or less contrarian, I think, as we move 10 years beyond the Zero RB articles. But the Twitter handle is still there, although it is not being used. But today, Shawn, we're going to look at one of your recent pieces that went up over the holiday weekend in the US, July 3rd. This one went up on rotoviz.com, looking at potential ways to get a little bit contrarian in best ball, but checking through the evidence of whether it is something that could turn your team into a tournament champion, or will it make your roster crash and burn. We're going to be looking at second-year quarterbacks and how that potential leap may be able to catapult your teams to success on that side of things. You did some very interesting conversations last week with Ben Gretsch when you looked at some of the rookie options that have come into the league and how that might affect the offenses. So I'm looking forward to looking at historical information here and then what it might mean for 2022. On the other side of things, myself and Shawn haven't done an actual podcast recording in quite a while as I was traveling both to Toronto and London, as I mentioned. So it's been a busy couple of weeks, but great to be back here, I guess, talking to Shawn again after a kind of a 2-week gap. So looking forward to sharing this information with the listeners today. How are you feeling, Shawn, after we can't really say hiatus because the podcasts continue to come out for everyone to listen to, and but we haven't had a chance to talk, so I hope things are going good with you.
Yeah, Colm was so good on the scheduling side that we did have content. But yeah, you are back. You were doing some serious globe trotting. Colm, how was the vacation? How was the trip to London? What did you think of your little stint over here in the US?
Shawn, I just, geography was never my strong point at school, and now I've come back from Canada. My understanding is that Canada is not part of America. Are we correct here? I feel like sometimes I see clips of people from America talking about Europe, and I'm like, how do they know that, like, anything about Europe? But am I completely wrong here?
No. As you mentioned there, Canada would not want to be included in the
It's not US, like an additional state or anything, no?
No, not for a variety of
not
reasons.
Yet.
Exactly, not yet. No, so how was your trip to North America, Colm? You messaged me about Niagara Falls. Obviously, you can get there from either country. I tend to think of it from the U.S. side. But yeah, you had a fun trip to Canada and saw the sights.
Yeah, no, it was absolutely awesome. We were there for 10 days, really action-packed, fitted a huge amount in. We were there, obviously, we had our daughter who's 5 there, so there's always that kind of balance of how to get everything in, but we got the Niagara Falls in. We went, obviously, from, as you mentioned, the Canadian side, and the part, for me, again, very interesting, like, the bridge that separates the border kind of goes over the river at the Niagara Falls, so a huge kind of bucket list item checked off with, kind of one of the wonders that you can see in the world. So amazing city. We were based in Toronto for that entire time, so absolutely loved it. I know we have some Australian listeners. I spent some time in Melbourne when I was younger, and I would see a lot of similarities between those two cities in terms of the city layout and structure and the way that their kind of transport system and things work. So I thought it was right up there with anywhere that I've ever been, Shawn. So the trip was definitely worth the time. And you asked about the London part of things. Obviously, we did a live Scottish Bowl, which was an absolute blast. Got to meet a lot of people again, even though we're closer on this side that I've never got to meet in person. So an absolutely awesome experience.
And you, in your draft, went with a Lamar Jackson, TJ Hawkinson start. Pretty happy with that?
I am. I mentioned to you before, I was hoping maybe that Travis Kelce would last that one more selection. He went at the 4th pick, which is kind of seems to be the way things are going with the tight end extra kind of additional premium points for the Scott Fish Bowl this year. But started off that way and got Hawkinson in the 2nd round, which I thought was nice. I did get sniped a few times. I was very tempted, very hopeful of maybe getting Pitts as another elite tight end option to try and make the team a little bit more unique. But went, I'm sure some people may have seen this on Twitter, I would say a 0 RB build, especially for the way the Scott Fish Bowl settings are set up. So I think it was a fun team. We talk about having fun, Shawn. It is a charity contest, one of our favorite contests to play in with so many analysts, so many people from around the fantasy football community. And Scott's done an amazing job there. I want to thank him again for letting us give away one entry to that. We wish that contestants good luck. We've had actually the people who have won entries in True OT have had quite a good run over the last couple of years, Shawn, getting into kind of semifinals, finals, and so on. So let's hope that trend continues this year. But yeah, fun time. Shawn, your draft is only starting because I got the live draft experience. I only have 2 picks left at this particular point in time. Shawn has 1 pick made, Shawn. The 101 went to Shawn. Who did you go with?
Well, I went ahead and took Justin Jefferson just because it's fun to take Justin Jefferson. The Scott Fish Bowl is probably the format where wide receiver is the most underpowered. And yet, you could argue that's going to make Jefferson separate from the rest of the position even more. Mostly I did it just for fun. However, as you mentioned, we're in so many of these leagues, and when you get a chance to play one for charity and for fun, you go ahead and do that. We'll see how it works out. Sometimes the 2-3 turn will bring you back some interesting quarterbacks. One of the things that we've talked a lot about in the Superflex Best Ball formats is that obviously you need to start with an elite QB if you have that option. Obviously I did. But then when you don't, there are some really cool teams that you can build. I've been chatting a little bit with Connor O'Driscoll about some of the Superflex rosters that he has. It's a lot of fun. We encourage people to play those formats. So get in there. We'll have a lot more FFPC Superflex Best Ball content. But Colm, as you were talking about best ball and as you were talking about how we can try and turn some contrarian plays into options that give us a shot at winning tournaments, we've been doing a lot of work on the quarterback position at RotoViz this offseason. When you think about these big tournaments, quarterback becomes extremely important. One of the things I discussed at the beginning of this article is sort of the transition that we've made through the last decade and how it's been really interesting, where at the very beginning of it, and certainly if you go back into that 2008, 2009 time period, chatted a little bit with Thomas about this in the Remember the Game episode where he and I talked about Chiefs Colts 2003, where the Dick Vermeil juggernaut falls to Peyton Manning in one of his greatest seasons, but how you kind of have this evolution from elite quarterback, where you have a handful of guys who are really scoring and you need to get on those points, to then the rise of late round QB, to where, I went through this time period. I always kind of joke about this high stakes team that I drafted, where I actually took my first quarterback after I had selected a kicker. And so, that late round QB is very much a part of things when you're taking a kicker first. Now we're back into this very different dynamic where quarterbacks are extremely relevant. And I think that one of the real pushes to get that across came from Mike Beers and his best ball tools, where you can see that window QB is very much the preferred play. And when you go out of window QB, you're giving up a lot in terms of win rate. But then you have another move beyond that, where now we have rushing QBs and we have a handful of teams with elite passing QBs where they're going to lean into the analytics a little bit and say some of these situations where teams have run in the past and they tend to be run downs or run game environments, because you have the lead in the second half, what have you, that you still actually want to pass in those situations, especially if you have a Patrick Mahomes, for example. And so now we have even a little bit more of a spread. Some of the guardrails that we had where a Peyton Manning, looking back to some of those great Peyton Manning seasons, I mean, he had one of his greatest years ever and didn't even throw the ball 500 times, right? You think about what he would have done if he gets to 550, if he gets to 575, if they're throwing in these situations where you lead late. On the flip side of that, in the past, we've also had very favorable garbage time that creates additional points for especially some guys like a Jameis Winston, for example, somebody who actually does have a good arm but makes a lot of turnovers. He can balance that out by throwing for a lot in garbage time. Well, we have teams like the Atlanta Falcons, like the Chicago Bears, where even when you are losing late, you decide to lean into what you do best. You're going to try and minimize the overall scoring gaps. Margin. Yeah, I mean, you're going to more or less tank and just point to the next season. And so for that reason, we get this potentially larger spread. And as a result, the elite QBs pull away. So, I mean, it's a combination of things, but obviously the hybrid element for some of the top quarterbacks is going to be really the kicker there. So now, Colm, we're in this environment where Michael Dubner has a great piece on elite QB and why you might want to pursue elite QBs in underdog formats. Blair Andrews just dropped an article talking about how window QB is still probably alive and well, discussing a few of the trends from the last couple of seasons that have knocked that down. Last year, we had a lot of injuries within the window, and we expect that to still be successful. But Colm, in this piece today, I kind of go through some of the weaknesses or trade-offs that we get when we select a quarterback early and when we select QBs, at least in 2023 in the window, why we might be a little bit more skeptical of window this season, and then propose a third path.
Yeah, and you mentioned there is a lot that has changed in best ball, not just from the contests that are available or even in fantasy football from those days that you talked about versus where we're moving now, and then where quarterback ADP seems to have settled. I think at this point we may be able to say, that it has changed a little bit over the last month or two, but pretty much still in similar ranges. And then the number of things that you can look to target. And you mentioned in this piece, the things that we're looking for at quarterback are the elite offenses, then potentially into the benefiting from hybrid quarterbacks with the added rushing value, but then also finding the breakouts. And I think that's the part, again, when we look at some of the contrarian elements, is being comfortable with what may not be comfortable to a lot of drafters at the time. And that leads into some of these players who maybe as a rookie, things didn't work out. Maybe they didn't have the opportunities that they wanted. Maybe it was a case that the offense didn't go in the direction. You mentioned the Falcons there. We might be touching on that again as we go through today's show. But trying to find those breakouts, and the reasons usually that they haven't fully broke out in that year one is that things didn't go according to plan. There is also the possibility that they did have a good rookie season, and then you're looking for that extended second year breakout, something that we've seen from Blair Andrews over the years, talking about the quarterback position and the improvement from year one to year two. So when we look through it, Shawn, I guess, do we want to look first from the historical aspect of how this has affected potential players in the past, or do we want to look at the potential options and how to find these breakouts for 2023?
Yeah, so if we start with the history, that gives us a little bit of a foundation for why we would be looking at this. And so I'm pulling up the FFPC Classic Explorer. We use the Classic format to give us a few more years. We go back to 2017. And I'm looking at rookie results, second-year results, and third-year results. We know that third year is the next most likely year for a quarterback breakout, and really the only year where we have significant breakouts other than that second year. And the dynamics are interesting because you not only have the scoring, but you have the price. And so when we look at win rates for both rookies and third-year players, they're just below average. So 8.2 and 8.1. The ADP for these quarterbacks as rookies, and again, we're looking at the Classic, but you can kind of work through, and you can certainly look up ADPs for the other quarterbacks in some other formats. But the Classic is going to push them down a little bit because you have the kicker and the defense element. But the rookie ADP, 226, right? Third-year ADP, 90. And so a huge difference in how much the QBs cost through that time period.
That's because of those breakouts that have happened already, obviously.
Right. So you're going to get the second year guys who have broken out are going to really push that up. One of the things that I've done here is I've removed quarterbacks who basically don't play at all. We're looking at the guys who are fantasy relevant for those seasons. So we're not factoring in some players like Paxton Lynch or Josh Rosen after he's no longer in the mix to start. We're looking at guys who are projected to be the starters on their teams here. The interesting thing, though, is that even when you include, and I also kind of show it without Trey Lance for people who are interested, but even when you include Lance, who gets injured in week 2 and is a very negative contributor to this second year dynamic, you have an average win rate of 10.4% for the second year guys. Again, just a massive gap between them and first and third, but also a massive gap between that win rate and the average win rate. What we see there is the ADP for the second year players, 122. So even with the kind of mix of results that you get from rookies, they do jump up quite a bit, but then there's a further jump to year 3. The scoring level for those two groups pretty similar, where second year players 291, third year players 298. So even though you enter year 2 with a lot of uncertainty in many cases, and one of the things that I do point out is that those averages and those win rates include a bunch of guys who did not break out, right? So you have Baker Mayfield, Dwayne Haskins, Zach Wilson, obviously Trey Lance. But even with those, the thing that we have happened in year 2 is that we have massive breakouts, right? And so you get huge wins from guys like Mahomes, Jackson. Herbert had an excellent rookie year, but he takes it up a notch in year 2. Trevor Lawrence, Burrow, Fields. Even guys like Jared Goff and Carson Wentz, who you might not remember quite as favorably in year 2, actually did really well. And then even down to players like Mitchell Trubisky and Sam Darnold. Those two guys combined for 10 QB1 finishes during their sophomore campaigns. And again, in best ball, I mean, those numbers will really play for you. So when you look at that and you look at how the second year quarterbacks were able to do all of this damage, it really does come from a lot of guys having breakout seasons. When we compare the really high level results for all 3 time periods, we find that first and third year players combine for only 4 seasons with double digit win rates in that time. The second year guys combined for 9 seasons with double digit win rates. And so that year 2, when a lot of the players are still inexpensive, but historically they've taken this jump. And it's something where Blair's original analysis stretches back before this time period. So one of the questions I had for this piece and for this exercise was, did the trend that Blair found as being very strong when he looked at this in 2019, did this continue through 19, 20, 21, 22? Is it giving us league winners that then put us in position to have teams that would be tournament winners? Colm, it's really encouraging when you look through the past. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to necessarily get those guys in 2023, right? It could be that 2023 is a bust season for those players. But just like we look at that wide receiver position and we say, this is an area where the players have a really wide range of outcomes. And as long as you get a reasonable price. Now, some of the year 2 guys, I mean, if you're drafting a Garrett Wilson or a Chris Olave, those guys have to hit because they're being drafted as though they're full-blown stars. Now, they were so good as rookies that I think that you can justify that. But when we're looking at some of the rest of the players, as long as you're not overpaying for a Christian Watson, for a Jahan Dotson, for a George Pickens, for a Jameson Williams, those players have historically been very, very interesting. We know that they get more expensive through time as more drafters understand the value of, number one, the fact that guys who are good in college, they tend to break out. You don't have to worry as much about their rookie production as maybe you've had to worry, or just maybe people have worried in the past. But then number 2, the value of drafting players with a lot of uncertainty, if there are strong evidence-based reasons to believe the talent is there, that has been very successful. So, Colm, as we're trying to translate that to the QB position, I think especially now that QB values have tightened and there's a little bit less that's exploitable with ADP across those first 15, 16, 17 QBs that, I mean, traditionally you've needed to have some kind of a plan with those guys to make it work. We want to make sure we're at least considering that environment and the breakout environment for quarterbacks, although again, we have to contrast it with what history tells us in some other ways, which is that late round QBs have been extremely unsuccessful.
Yeah, so that is part of it, is that they have been unsuccessful, but part of it as well at this point when we're looking at as well, like, for 2023 is the price of particularly the elite quarterbacks, but then with the elite quarterbacks getting pushed up, that is also kind of moving up the entire quarterback window. And some of the guys who, when we looked at running backs in the past, we felt were going 2 to 3 rounds ahead of where they should be. We're seeing that with some quarterback options this year, and the advantage is that if you're taking players at other positions in that range, and the whole reason you would be waiting on quarterback is to take those other players at other positions, and then the cost of then acquiring some of these guys, particularly when we're looking at the targets that we're looking for in that kind of second year cohort of quarterbacks, the price isn't going to be that expensive too, with the potential for those to outgain that. A couple of things, Shawn, in this piece, you did split it out as well by hybrid and pass orientated, kind of, as we would traditionally have called pocket passers, but guys now with more mobility than the traditional pocket passers, but not quite your Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Deshaun Watson. When we look at that, there isn't a huge difference in those guys in terms of what they done. Kind of the one that really broke the mold was Kyler Murray as a rusher, giving him that upside for the 316 points. Daniel Jones with 259, also kind of standing out for that hybrid cohort. But
and what you're referring to right here are the rookie seasons. So the question that I wanted to ask was, maybe rookies have underperformed, but there's still a way to find exploitable subgroups within that. What we see here is that, again, at least historically, that hasn't been the case. Yeah. So thanks for clarifying that. So then again, we're not talking specifically on this about the rookies, but then that's interesting based on the price maybe for, let's say, Anthony Richardson this year coming in as the hybrid quarterback as a rookie. But when we look into then what has happened for the second year campaigns, we're looking at players who have then had that breakout that has really and truly exceeded, the ADP that they're drafted at. And that was something that I think people think about a lot is, will this player achieve his ADP? Is he, going to finish as a 8th round ADP? But the players that then really truly smash your league and have this success is the players who are drafted in that mid to late range, who then just finish in those top 12, top 8 quarterbacks that really just supercharge your roster and push it right over the edge in these best ball formats. So when you look, Shawn, then into the second year guys, and just to kind of go back through some of the names that have really broke out, for example, I was talking to a lot of people this weekend at that best ball or the fantasy football conference about best ball, and talking about people's expectation and perception, and the likes of a Trevor Lawrence last year, who, if you drafted Trevor Lawrence last year, he is somebody who really broke that mold. Even the likes of a Jared Goff or a Carson Wentz in their second season. So who are some of the players that really stand out when you look back through these kind of past 7 or 8 years? Yeah, so if you look at the guys with those 9 seasons where we get double-digit win rates, you get Mahomes in 2017, where his ADP is kept in check by not playing as a rookie. He goes out and scores a huge number of points, over 450, and wins at over 23%. We're not going to have too many seasons like that, but you do see the influence of it as then we go down through as well, where Lamar Jackson, over 20% win rate. Another situation there where, today both of those guys would probably start, you would argue, and yet, we're not that far removed from the season there for Patrick Mahomes. So actually, it's the rookie year 2017, the next year 2018, where he goes off. I've got these guys listed by their rookie year, so you can see when they came into the league and then how they make that jump. You get a very solid season from Carson Wentz that goes at almost 13%. Joe Burrow makes the leap, 380 approximate points there, wins at almost 13%. It's easy to forget because Jared Goff finished so poorly with the Rams that the initial results when Sean McVay came in and brought receivers like Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods and Sammy Watkins, that he goes off, wins at 12.3%. Herbert takes that massive jump again in year 2 that probably put too much pressure on him for this past year, where it's just difficult, again, for those pass-oriented QBs to maintain that level of scoring. But even though he had one of the earliest ADPs, his ADP in that season was 69 overall. He puts up enough points to generate a 12% win rate. Justin Fields last year, even with the atrocious first month, goes for an 11% win rate. You just mentioned Trevor Lawrence. He goes just below 11%. And then we talked about Mitchell Trubisky, who, again, a little better than people realize, gets up there in the 300-point range and did it in a season where his ADP was 150. And so, especially if we're looking for seasons that could be vaguely similar to what Carson Wentz did, vaguely similar to what Mitchell Trubisky did, I mean, I think you could make an argument that we've got guys who have a Jared Goff level of talent in this class. And so, Colin, that kind of takes us to the next portion of this, which is to look at the weapons these players are surrounded by. And we won't go into the great detail on it on the show, but one of the things that was really shocking was that regardless of how good the quarterback turned out to be, his early career production tracked very closely with how strong the weapons were. And so you have guys like Watson, Mahomes, Herbert, Burrow, who break out more or less instantly. And those guys are surrounded by stars. You've got some players with mediocre weapons like a Wentz, a Murray, a Zach Wilson. Those guys are a little bit more determined by their own talent. Kyler Murray able to overcome it. But when we look at the guys with poor weapons, you have players who in their rookie seasons, I mean, Jared Goff had nothing around him, Trubisky, nothing, Darnold, nothing, Josh Allen, nothing, Lamar Jackson, very, very little, Daniel Jones, nothing. I mean, Daniel Jones has been working with Darius Slayton, basically as his wide receiver one. Dwayne Haskins, very little. Tua, nothing to start. And then over the subsequent 2 seasons, they add Jalen Waddle, they add Tyreek Hill. Suddenly you've got a very different situation there. Mac Jones, not very much. Justin Fields, not very much. That part is interesting, and I kind of go through that, all 3 groups, but certainly the third group, not only talking about who they started with, but then who the team added and when the quarterback fully launched and how in so many cases that corresponded. So we're not saying that the weapons are going to determine the quarterback, but they clearly help. And I mean, that's not any kind of groundbreaking conclusion. That's very intuitive. But in best ball, we have a couple of different elements there. One of the reasons that drafters like to make some of these correlated bets is just a big picture approach to it, where if the quarterback has a good season, it makes it easier for the wide receivers to have good seasons. If the quarterback stays healthy, and that was one of the things I kind of go through at the beginning of the article, is how QB health has determined, and QB health on other teams as well, because it's not just scoring in a vacuum. It's scoring relative to what other types of scoring are available in your league that year. But if the QB stays healthy, it's going to help the wide receivers. And so you're kind of thinking, well, I'm going to draft some receivers around this QB because if he stays healthy, it'll be a rising tides, lifts all boats kind of situation. But also if the receivers are there, it's going to wash back on the quarterback and he's going to have a chance to play better. But then you obviously have that secondary element as well, where the game stacks in the tournament portion, when you're thinking about week 15, 16, 17, those things are very important also. So when you have quarterbacks who are surrounded by multiple plus weapons, not only does it help them, but it gives you these tactical advantages. So we look at the guys for 2023 who are breakout options, and we have 8 players. You can also include Jordan Love if you want. He's not in the first 3 years, but he's getting his first chance to start. And you have the great weapon group with Pickett, Purdy, Ridder, and Howell, the mediocre weapon group with Richardson, Jones, and Love, and the poor weapon group with Young and Stroud. And so one of the reasons that we've been avoiding Young and Stroud is that you have the rookie dynamic where especially rookies who aren't going to run, that's been tough to score in a way that wins in the past, but then they also have poor weapons. Does that mean that they can't do it? That it's impossible? No. I mean, every year you have individual players that break historical trends and do damage in leagues. Ben Gretsch and I, as you mentioned at the beginning, did a show recently talking about the rookie signal callers, kind of where they are, where their teams are, what the projections look like, what the scenarios are for these passers and their teams. That was really interesting. exercise to kind of think through. And I mean, we like Bryce Young. We like CJ Stroud. In a vacuum, those are very talented players. Maybe it works out for them. It's a little bit harder to see where the ceiling would really be. I mean, they're going to have to be unbelievable, which players come out and are unbelievable. And that's a lot of fun when they are. But you look at the other guys, and the problem that we run into here, Colm, is that in that great weapons group, 3 of the 4 guys were not first-round picks. And the entire exercise that the article is based on focuses on first-round picks. So then obviously you've got a problem because you're comparing apples and oranges. So then I go through a little bit and look at some of these guys who had won the job, who weren't first-round picks, but had won the job going into year 2. And there just aren't that many. So there aren't a lot of conclusions to draw. You're more just trying to get a little bit of a feel. And so when you're talking about Russell Wilson, Dak Prescott, I mean, those guys were established stars. Does that really give you too much information? Davis Mills, someone who basically the Texans were not a real NFL franchise at that time. That doesn't give you much information. Gardner Minshew, Jalen Hurts, a little bit more interesting there. We know about Hurts. If you think about Gardner Minshew, it's interesting because he was actually putting up big numbers when he got hurt in week 5, and then they eventually figured out he was hurt. And after week 7, he does get put on the bench. Any of the 4 guys who seem like even vaguely real comps, if you got their points, you'd be very happy. But again, I don't know that we can just take those guys and say, okay, the players from this season are going to score. But Colm, one of the reasons we're looking at Brock Purdy, we're looking at Sam Howell, we're looking at Desmond Ridder, is that there are interesting elements to their own games. I mean, Purdy was a fantastic player last year as a late round rookie. Can he build on that? I mean, the question with Purdy and the thing holding his ADP down is the injury and how quickly he's back to 100% this season. Sam Howell, somebody we thought should have been drafted a lot earlier, but a huge range of outcomes for him. He could play poorly in camp and never start a game. He could play poorly in week 1, 2, or 3 and get benched. And so with Howell, more than really scoring profile, I think you're worried about the immense benching risk there. And then for Desmond Ridder, it seems like less benching risk, but also less upside. He played last season. His EP, we're thinking about sort of an FFPC perspective, would be in that 18.4 range, where if you get that type of volume from him, you're going to be fine. And yet he underperformed it in a big way last season. So we kind of work through that. We think about what those guys are able to do in this year, and it's exciting. You want to build some teams with them. But then I finish out the piece by pointing out that when you draft your first quarterback after round 11 for 2017 to 2022 in this FFPC format that we're using just kind of to give us a broad benchmark, because we have a lot of seasons in there, just barely above 6%, which we know will not get the job done. Not only are you getting a really low win rate, but you're getting a low incidence of extremely high scoring teams. So we want to balance the different pieces of evidence that we have when we're thinking about how we would play these cheap potential breakout QBs.
Yeah, and before we get into maybe final thoughts, Shawn, I did want to mention the article itself. I will link to it in today's show notes, but there is so much detail in it. Shawn mentioned, the weapons part of it. I thought that was one of the most interesting parts. I know there's obviously the entire article, Shawn, is very interesting, but when we look at what they had when they came in as a rookie and what the changes were, for example, Joe Burrow, and there's a lot of this that's unlucky for Burrow in terms of he had a serious injury, missed a big part of that season, but that also helped them get a high draft pick, which ended up being Jamar Chase, which then launched him completely in that second season. But there's little bits and pieces like that. But some teams then didn't really change a lot, but they were some of the guys who, like a Patrick Mahomes, who has turned out to just be one of the best quarterbacks of all time when he is finished. But it's interesting to see, even the poor weapons and what players were able to achieve with those guys. So lots of great information. I would highly recommend people read the entire article to get the full breakdown. I know Shawn's covered a lot of it as we've talked through it today, but you mentioned the likes of Purdy, Howell, and Ridder. The part when we get to the weapons element of it is those guys now, and people may not fully agree with Howell, but there's a very, very interesting pieces for him on that offense. But the likes of Ridder, that offense, while it hasn't done anything really as of yet. If you look at the players that they have on the offensive side of the ball, at running back, tight end, and wide receiver, they have a lot of high draft capital invested in those positions, which, he may not hit, but and the coaching may not be exactly what we want, but he has the players around him, I think, to be able to help make that happen. Purdy finds himself in the situation in San Francisco with just a huge amount of talent around him. So I think, what are you thinking when we look at the guys, obviously, that are being compared to potential Hurts-like options this year? It's going to be hard to hit that Hurts level, but you're looking at players like Purdy, Howell, and Ridder. But those guys also, when we look at the comps for what players had around them from a talent perspective, those guys have superb options on those offenses as well to help, as you mentioned, kind of raise all the ships. And the other part, outside of the aspect there with the 49ers, you look at the Falcons, for example, and Washington, both teams where it is possible to build those stacks on those rosters versus the cost of building them with some of the elite quarterbacks. Very hard to pair those together with their preferred past options, where with those second-year guys, potential to do that.
There is. And I mean, you went through a little bit on the Falcons and the Commanders there. The 49ers probably have the most talented offense in the NFL. And it gives you more shots to build those guys in. Now, with all the buzz around Brandon Ayuk, the 49ers guys, it's kind of a weird combination where they're discounted and yet they're still tricky because they're still in that range where you're going to have hard choices. You look at the early rounds in 2023 and you get such great values on running backs that it just creates an entirely different calculation than anything that we've seen in the past. One of the reasons why you could mix in that elite QB, one of the reasons why we've always focused on elite tight end, is that running backs were so structurally overvalued that there was really no point where you're trying to create any type of running back depth or maybe even running back exposure at all. So if you end up 0 RB, you're fine with that. If you end up anchor RB, you're fine with that. All of the evidence would suggest that once you go beyond that, you start to decrease your chances to win. Now, there have been some different time periods where a double anchor would have worked. And one of the things that I talk about in terms of going through one of the recent drafts I did with Pete, for example, and in terms of talking about the draft that we'll be releasing, that Ben and I did for this week. In 2021, you had double anchor running back generate a very nice win rate in Underdog. And so it's interesting that we're so wide receiver heavy now, but we know that you wanted the elite tight end. We know that when you add additional running backs, your chances to win and your ability to create this really elite team suffer. And so the lack of immediacy or urgency at the running back position give you so many other options. Well, in 2023, the urgency is really around running back because you see these guys who have the really high EP profile, that potential double-digit rush EP, the double-digit receive EP. Obviously, our buddy Patrick Corain has done a ton of great research on it, looking at it from a slightly different perspective than EP, but talking about the legendary profile. When you get guys like that in rounds 2, round 3, and you can add multiple players to your build at times where the wide receivers just simply aren't appealing at all because they've been pushed up so much. You have to do that. Well, now you're like, where do I get that elite tight end? Because I do have to still draft wide receivers. Where do I get that elite QB? Because I still do have to draft wide receivers. It's not that you're going to eliminate those guys from builds. You're not going to go completely from one thing in the past to a different thing now, but you're going to have a mix of builds. And one of the things you just have to consider this year is if there's a way to address quarterback a little bit less expensively, it seems like we're getting the perfect opportunity with the specific guys who are there, the ADPs that they have, the weapons who surround them. I don't think that you want to go 100% on that. You may not want to go 50% on that, but you do want to mix some of those teams in, specifically for what we've been talking about and what you just mentioned there with the 49ers guys, but also what you get with the Commanders, what you get with the Falcons, where, and is Drake London overvalued? I mean, he probably is. Is Kyle Pitts still a little bit of a tricky play? He probably is. Is Jahan Dotson risky at the point you have to take him to help build out that 49ers Commanders game stack? Yes. But as long as you're doing it in a way that does create benefits for you, that has a little bit of safety built in, you're not reaching for Dotson in every single draft. You want to keep from a situation where you get locked in on just a couple of guys and you start to have terrible ADP value on those specific players on all of your teams. As long as you stay away from that, then you can just create so much in the way of correlated upside with these players that if it hits, it's not just going to be good for you. It's going to be really, really good.
Yeah, and the other thing that's interesting, especially with the Falcons, and I know last year we punched the coaching situation a lot, and it's going to be similar this year, but if that offense takes a step in the right direction from a play calling perspective, you're looking at guys who are also in their second or third season or rookie season with their running back, for example. You mentioned Dotson, we have him. If those wide receivers take that leap forward too, that's going to, again, another reason to pull up that entire ship. And you're looking at that with the young player rather than maybe if they're paired with a bunch of veterans. And I know there is some young players as well, say in Carolina, but there's a very different situation when that rookie quarterback is paired with the veteran options. But I think, Shawn, we will leave it there. But the one thing that, as you mentioned, going back through what players are going to be available at that point and how your team will finish up with that structure based on what you do in those rounds. I'm going to give a plug for the podcast that came out in the middle of last week. That one was the kind of drafting back to front, or that kind of approach to strategy that we talked through. Got a lot of positive feedback on that. So I would recommend, if anyone hasn't checked that out, to head back and listen to it. I think I titled it something, Shawn, like "This strategy will change your life," or something like, very, very.
I was like, what is this episode actually about? It's like, I know it's going to change my life, but
could be anything.
Which one did Colm title that?
Yeah,
so that is the reverse engineering your lineup, the reverse draft, because reverse engineering really a little bit different, but reverse drafting, back to front, Colm, I love it.
Yeah, so check that one out. But that is going to do it for this edition of the show. Make sure you are subscribed if you aren't already. Drop us a written and review. If you're watching this on YouTube, drop us a comment. Let us know your thoughts. We are looking forward to bringing you much more content as we head towards the NFL season. And Shawn, that will be here before we know it. We're into July at this point already. So time flying by. Looking forward to bringing that content for our audience. So until we are back with another show, my name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Check out his work, including the piece linked in today's show notes on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.